الإسرائيليون هم الذين يصنعون.
Hezbollah's Secretary General hails Syria's presidential election results as a victory for the Syrian people. Russia's Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart called for an end to the violence in eastern Ukraine following informal talks. The Iraqi army kills 75 foreign insurgents, while militant attacks across the country leave over 30 dead. And a hunger strike by Palestinians languishing in Israeli jails passes the 40-day mark. Hello and welcome to Al World News with me, Sergeant Preradovic. Well, during a memorial ceremony in the Lebanese capital, Hezbollah's Secretary General Syed Hassan Nasrallah delivered a speech tackling the latest domestic and regional developments. On Syria, Syed Nasrallah reiterated that a political solution in the war-torn country stands on two pillars: accepting the results of the June 3rd presidential elections and stopping support for Takfiri groups.
The political solution in Syria stands on two pillars. One, accepting the results of the presidential elections. And two, stopping the support to the Takfiri groups, which will help end the fighting in Syria. It is not enough that some Arab and regional countries put these groups on the terrorist list, because there are some countries in the region who have done that but are still supporting them.
Well, Syed Nasrallah stressed that the Syrian presidential election was a popular declaration that the war on Syria has failed.
The election is a political unpopular declaration that the war on Syria has failed. Who wants a political solution in Syria cannot ignore the presidential elections, which point out that not only resolution depends on Geneva I or Geneva II, it's not true that the solution depends on the stepping down of President Assad, which is not an option anymore after the people have re-elected him. The elections tells the opposition and international and regional countries that the political solution starts and ends with Assad.
Well, on the domestic front, Syed Nasrallah called on all parties to exert real effort to salvage the presidential juncture.
We call for serious efforts and multi-party efforts to reach the needed result in the issue of the presidency. In light of our relation with Iran, I tell you that you should not await the outcome of the Iranian-Saudi negotiations, because until the moment, there is no known date and it's unknown if there will be an imminent date. The topics of the talks are still unknown, and no one has said that the presidential vote will be on the table of the negotiations. I urge all the keen parties to exert real efforts to salvage the presidential juncture. The Saudis are openly saying that they don't want to interfere, which means that no one wants to interfere. We call for domestic efforts to hold the vote.
Well, labeled as a dictator and as a murderer of his own people by Western governments and Arab monarchies, the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad has trumped these claims after his triumph in this week's presidential elections. Assad's victory has seriously undermined the Western-backed efforts to oust his government.
Throughout the 3-year conflict in Syria, an air of confidence has surrounded President Bashar al-Assad, despite Western and Persian Gulf countries' narrative that the Assad government lacks popular legitimacy and stays in power by systematically killing its own people. This confidence was in full display during the presidential elections. Millions flooded the streets and the ballot boxes across Syria, showing the depth of popular support for his government. In the midst of a war that has seen militant groups and foreign fighters occupy territories around the country, President Assad convincingly won with 88.7%. According to Syria's Supreme Constitutional Court, a massive 73.42% of over 50 million eligible voters weathered the violence and took part in the elections. Though internationally condemned and characterized as a dictator, Assad was able to conjure up mass support during the vote, unseen in Syria's history. Assad is seen as the only figure that can stabilize the country and ensure a secular rule that respects all minority communities. After 3 years of brutal fighting that has left many areas of the country devastated, no real opposition have come close to being able to compete with Assad. The first are the domestic non-parliamentary opposition groups represented by the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change, which opposes foreign involvement in Syria's war and supports non-violent resistance and negotiations with the government. The organization called for a ceasefire agreement before elections and boycotted the polls. The second are the thousands of desperate fighters and extremist militant organizations fighting the Syrian army, which include the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the Al-Nusra Front, and other groups with ties to Al-Qaeda. Those organizations are said to be receiving support, arms, and training from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, but have been fighting each other as of late. Based in Istanbul, the third group is made of exiled pro-Western members. The SNC represents a negligible segment on the ground in Syria and is not seen as credible inside Syria as Western media likes to claim. The organization receives tremendous financial and diplomatic backing from the United States and other Western and Arab countries. Those in the West and the Persian Gulf ridiculed the elections even before the first ballot paper went in. Those tirade comments will continue to blare from Western and Arab capitals, perched on a moral high ground that has collapsed and given way under the landslide of the Syrian people's choice.
Meanwhile, the Syrian army has recaptured the strategic town of Al-Thawra, situated in the suburbs of the capital, Damascus. Now, by securing the town, the government has regained access to vital supply routes. Al-Thawra was liberated after weeks of deadly street battles between Syrian army units and militants from the Al-Qaeda affiliate of the Al-Nusra Front. The latest victory comes while government forces continued their offensive against militants in the nearby town of Mleha. Well, amid those ongoing battles for control of the Syrian capital, the country's army and militants are guided more by what they hear than see. The two sides are battling in the bowels of Damascus, digging tunnels in a campaign to capture the eastern entrance to the capital.
These are no simple mole trails. Some extend for around 700 meters. Tunnels snake their way all over Syria. A creative military strategy that enables fighters to transport humans, prepare bombs, take cover, store weapons, and attack heavily guarded buildings. The army, for their part, has been charged with flushing militants out of their underground hideouts. To evade the snipers, men on both sides have linked the buildings they control through a network of tunnels dug through the red earth and lighted with lamps. Among many areas rigged with tunnels is the suburb of Jobar, next to the famous Abbasid Square, a stronghold of the Syrian government. The army knows that if it's lost to the militants, the entire capital is in danger. Inside an empty building, a hole in the floor leads to an observation room where army computers are linked to cameras rigged up inside a network of tunnels. But a captain in the Syrian army explains that the cameras are of only limited use in tracking the enemy's movements.
We depend above all on our ears. When we have located the source of the noise, we dig in that direction.
The bearded army officer in fatigues clarified that there are different types of tunnels.
The first tunnel is for food supplies, the second to communicate between our positions, and the third to evacuate the wounded.
Tunnel bombs are also being used as a powerful propaganda tool by militants who have otherwise suffered setbacks in most areas of the country. For now, It seems like there are two wars being fought in Syria, one above and one underground, in what has been described as the war of moles against hornets. The militants are the moles, digging underground to create tunnels away from the fighter jets and helicopters of the army, which buzz overhead.
In her new memoir, the former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton claims to have favored arming the Syrian militants since the early days of the conflict. In a section of the book, Clinton says, "I returned to Washington reasonably confident that if we decided to begin arming and training moderate Syrian rebels, we could put in place effective coordination with our regional partners. The risks of both action and inaction were high. Both choices would bring unintended consequences. The president's inclination, was to stay the present course and not take the significant further step of arming rebels." Well, meanwhile, the al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front has reportedly killed a Syrian teenager in eastern Lebanon. According to the Lebanese Daily Star newspaper, the extremist militants who have crossed from Syria into neighboring Lebanon reportedly executed a 14-year-old boy and threw his body on a road in the eastern Arsel region. It was not immediately clear why the Takfiri militants killed the boy, but media reports said the teenager who worked at a gas station got into a dispute with the terrorists. Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups such as the al-Nusra Front have been behind numerous attacks in Lebanon, which has suffered from the spillover of violence from Syria. Moving on to some other news now, and Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Ukrainian President-elect Petro Poroshenko during the 70th D-Day commemorations in France. The two leaders called on the warring sides in eastern Ukraine to end the bloodshed.
Breaking the crisis ice. It took the 70th anniversary of D-Day on the Normandy shores of France to get both Ukraine and Russia's presidents talking. The meeting between Russia's Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President-elect Petro Poroshenko lasted for 15 minutes, a culmination of weeks of secret diplomacy by French officials. According to French government sources, both leaders shook hands on a potential ceasefire agreement between Kiev forces and pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. While the Russian president welcomed Poroshenko's proposals to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine, Putin insisted that Kiev's punitive military operation must end.
I cannot but commend the position of Mr. Poroshenko that bloodshed should be stopped immediately in the east of Ukraine, and he has a plan in that regard. What plan this is, you'd better ask not me but him. He told me about it in a few words, but it's one thing to talk about it here in France, and it's another thing to explain it in his own country.
President Putin also warned against a potential EU association agreement with Ukraine, saying Moscow will take measures to defend its own economy.
Here we talked in detail both with the British Prime Minister, with the President of France and with the German Chancellor, as well as with Mr. Poroshenko, in relation to the planned signing of the well-known association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. I warned that we will have to take measures to defend our economy, our market. As soon as this agreement is signed and comes into force, we will have to take measures to defend our own economy.
But this wasn't Putin's only French encounter. The Russian president had a short-lived rendezvous with US President Barack Obama, the first since Crimea's integration into Russia back in March. Ironically, the most serious European security crisis since the end of the Cold War was the most dominant feature during commemorations of an event which killed 15,000 troops.
This day, which began in chaos and fire, would end in blood and tears and pain, tears and joy at the end of 24 hours that changed the world forever and marked Normandy. I would like that today, on this 70th anniversary, the nation pays homage to all civilians and soldiers.
And while Hitler's Germany is history in Europe's books, Old allies may need to make amends to avert a potentially deadly conflict, as more people in Ukraine continue to lose their lives.
Meanwhile, eastern Ukraine has been plunged into further chaos as Kiev's government steps up its military offensive in the region. The ongoing fighting has forced thousands to flee their homes.
The Ukrainian army is continuing its military operation in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. But the pro-Russian activists are fighting back. This amateur footage shows a moment when separatists shot down a Ukrainian fighter jet. This as authorities in the city of Slavyansk have asked for assistance in evacuating civilians who are fleeing the intense violence. About 350 children, along with their parents, have already been evacuated and safely delivered to a children's camp in the Odessa region. Meanwhile, the flood of refugees from Ukraine to Russia is growing. According to Russian sources, 12,000 women, children, and elderly people cross the border in a single day. The southern Russian Rostov region has declared an emergency situation and asked Moscow for help in dealing with the displaced Ukrainians. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev said that Kiev has turned a blind eye to the looming humanitarian crisis in the violence-hit east. He also called the Ukraine government's denial of refugees in Russia a lie. The mass migration comes as the Kiev government closed several checkpoints on the border with Russia in Lugansk and Donetsk regions, claiming the measure was in response to an increasing threat from the Russian side of the border after 15 anti-Kiev activists were killed in clashes with the government troops at a border crossing. Outgoing interim President Alexander Turchinov, who will be replaced on Saturday with the inauguration of President Petro Poroshenko, has urged the leaders of all security-related agencies and ministries to urgently consider the declaration of martial law in eastern Ukraine. And even though reports have surfaced proving that troops loyal to Kiev have systematically targeted civilians, killing over 100 people in recent weeks, Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk is declaring victory.
We are winning and we will win. Ukraine will get rid of the terrorists. Banditry and terrorism, which is sponsored by Russia, will be destroyed.
The fighting has mostly centered around the cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk in the northern portion of the Donetsk region, with the military claiming to have killed more than 300 rebels in the last 24 hours. The snipers which man these checkpoints are now laying in wait for the next battle and inevitably their next kill.
Let's cross over to London now and speak to political analyst William Spring. Mr. Spring, let's go back to the news coming out of France these last couple of hours. Putin and Poroshenko speaking the same language. Is this a sign of a de-escalation?
No, I think it's just a sign of good manners. It's got no relation whatsoever to what is going on in Ukraine. Mr. Putin is a man of considerable acumen in terms of dealing with people. Necessarily, he knows there's no value to be gained in him refusing to shake the hand of Poroshenko, Mr. Poroshenko, the president-elect of the Ukraine, nor is there any mileage for him, Mr. Putin, in refusing to shake the hand of Prince Charles, who insulted the Russian president the other week by comparing him to Hitler. Well, if it hadn't been for the Russians in World War II, Prince Charles would have probably been put up against he wouldn't have even been thought of. The royal family in England would be dead. And it was the Russians who saved this country, Great Britain, as well, of course, with the Americans, but the Russians took the majority of casualties in the Second World War. And I think the attack on, that's another point, but the attack on Mr. Putin, both by Prince Charles, and by Poroshenko, the Kiev junta president, so-called, is appalling. The situation in the East needs to be rectified as soon as possible by direct mediation of the United Nations. as things are, Britain, France, and the United States are inciting and
Okay, we appear to be experiencing some technical difficulties there. That was a political analyst, William Springs, speaking to us from London. Well, a wave of blasts in eastern and western Iraq has killed and injured scores of people. The attacks targeted a mosque and a busy market in the northern city of Mosul and the western province of Anbar. Meanwhile, the Iraqi army has foiled another militant attack in the east, killing 75 insurgents.
The Iraqi army is stepping up efforts to root out al-Qaeda militants from the country. 75 insurgents belonging to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant were killed during a military operation in the northern city of Mosul. According to reports, many of these militants were of foreign origin. Meanwhile, terrorist attacks carried out by the ISIL are continuing in a premeditated fashion across Iraq. The latest explosion hit the city of Baquba, with the number of casualties still unknown. In Mosul, a northern city which has been one of the focal points of the attacks, back-to-back blasts went off outside a mosque in Miqdadiya village. Police said suicide bombers detonated 2 vehicles while on the move. The morning explosions left 36 people dead and several others injured, many of whom included women and children. Several buildings were also shattered, as medical sources said that the number of casualties is likely to rise. Meanwhile, the Iraqi army failed an attack by an al-Qaeda-affiliated group on one of the residential areas, only hours after ISIL militants attacked a police convoy in the western Arba'in neighborhood, severely injuring 4 officers. Mosul's attacks coincided with even more violence in Anbar, where at least 1 person was killed and 9 others wounded after a roadside bomb went off inside a busy market west of the province. The Iraqi army has succeeded in quelling potential operations by the terrorist group in several cities and provinces. However, almost daily attacks are continuing to claim the lives of civilians across the country.
You're watching Al Ittijah World News, still to come. Bahrain's opposition reveals that the country's security forces have nabbed more than 200 children last year alone. Welcome back to Al Ittijah World News. Here's a recap of our top stories this hour. Hezbollah Secretary General hails Syria's presidential election results as a victory for the Syrian people. Russia's Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart called for an end to the violence in eastern Ukraine following an informal meeting. The The Iraqi army kills 75 foreign insurgents, while militant attacks across the country leave over 30 dead. And a hunger strike by Palestinians languishing in Israeli jails passes the 40-day mark. Well, around 125 Palestinians have been on a hunger strike for 40 days now. Most of them administrative detainees protesting against being held indefinitely without trial. Meanwhile, the Israelis are looking to step up their efforts to end the practice, which has attracted global attention to the plight of Palestinians languishing in Israeli jails.
40 days ago, 100 Palestinians began a hunger strike campaign in protest against being held without charge or trial in Israeli prisons. Since then, others have joined in, and this week, the total number of striking detainees reached 1,500. The figure poses a challenge for the Israelis because of the large number of prisoners taking part in their deteriorating health. Palestinian officials have accused the Israeli authorities of reneging on a previous deal reached in late May, which aimed to limit administrative detention to exceptional circumstances. Daily rallies have also been held in support of the prisoners by the Palestinian community. For his part, the UN chief Ban Ki-moon expressed concern about the deteriorating health of Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike, calling on the Israelis to charge or release them without delay. The UN High Commissioner has also expressed concern over a bill before the Knesset that would permit force-feeding of detainees on hunger strike against their will, in contravention of international law. But as the Knesset waits to vote on a bill giving them permission to force-feed the dozens of hospitalized inmates, the Israeli cabinet has another issue to worry about. Many doctors have already announced their refusal to go through with the procedure, saying it was unethical and professionally wrong. About 5,000 Palestinians are being held in Israeli prisons. Nearly 200 of them are under administrative detention orders. As these numbers continue to rise, many fear so will the number of hunger strikers.
Well, 3 years after the Arab Spring, and the crisis in Libya is deepening as violence in the east of the country intensifies amid a backdrop of political divisions.
When Libya threw off the shackles of dictatorship in its Arab Spring revolution, few could have imagined that 3 years later it would have two rival governments installed at opposite ends of the country, presiding over fighting that has in effect torn the nation apart. Amid an intensifying power struggle between the Islamist-dominated parliament and a rival interim government, the country's intelligence chief Salim al-Hassi submitted his resignation to parliament on Thursday. According to reports, al-Hassi resigned because he was frustrated with the parliament's insistence on appointing a new prime minister, a move that has only intensified the political crisis. The spy chief's resignation came as Libya's Supreme Constitutional Court convened to decide on the legality of the election of Prime Minister Ahmed Maitik. The court said it would issue its ruling on July 9th. Maitik was elected last month by the Islamist-led parliament in a contested vote, which prompted incumbent Prime Minister Abdullah al-Thinni to refuse to hand over the post until the judiciary decides on the matter. Maitik's appointment adds to Libya's political and security woes at a time when renegade General Khalifa Haftar is waging an offensive against militias. With no strong army or police force, militants quickly fill the security vacuum, and successive governments relied on them to restore order. They then mushroom in number and power, posing a challenge to any democratic transition. In recent weeks, forces allied with Haftar bombed his opponent's camps, and they responded by attacking his forces. On Thursday, a security official said at least 10 Grad rockets were fired into a district of the city of Benghazi, setting fire to several warehouses there. Rockets were also fired on the outskirts of Darna in eastern Libya, a stronghold of the Ansar al-Sharia armed group. As the government tries to restore security and stability to the North African nation, the process seems easier said than done. Authorities are waging a war on an unknown and invisible enemy, making the fight all the harder because of the weakness and divisions among Libya's security forces.
Well, African affairs expert Io Johnson earlier told us that Libya is likely to face further division and chaos on the political front as a result of the controversy surrounding Premier Metik's election.
We have the parliament that's divided, we have decision-making not taking place, and ultimately we have an election in terms of a prime minister that's in question. Ultimately, we're looking at a situation where you also have a general that's actually fighting against Islamists in the eastern part of the country, and you have the United States having nearly 1,000 Marines in the country. So I think we're looking at potentially a very messy situation that started a very long time ago when NATO went and ousted Muammar Gaddafi. Ultimately, what we do find now is chaos on the worst scale. If Libya is to become a democracy eventually, if it's to follow rule of law, then the court's decision has got to be respected. That said, it's down to him. Ultimately, I believe his supporters will tell the tale, and ultimately it will be determined as to what the parliament will do. But we will see fraction, we will see potentially further divide, and ultimately we will see a parliament which up until now has yet to decide properly, make some crucial decisions if at all the decisions they make and the court's ruling is not adhered to. There were questions as to the process, questions as to whether the parliament itself had overstayed its welcome, questions as to whether the right candidates were being put forward, and questions around the legitimacy surrounding the elections itself. Thus said, the courts, which are paramount, would have to make some crucial decisions. And of course, that's why the court's not making a decision in a hurry. They're taking their time to make sure they cross all the T's and dot all the I's, making sure they have a decision which hopefully will be welcomed by all. The general, as far as he was concerned, he was trying to rid the country of Islamic fundamentalists and the terrorists as he sees it. But Libyans nonetheless, and that thus far, he's received some support from Western nations, including the US. But he's taken the law into his own hands. He hasn't followed what the parliament has asked for. He hasn't followed what the prime minister has said. He's literally a law unto his own. And that said, makes things in Libya very, very tricky and very difficult. But the general does command support from the army, which is what he's leveraging on right now.
Well, thousands of Bahrainis have staged nationwide demonstrations against the Manama regime, calling for the Al Khalifa monarchy to relinquish power. The protesters chanted slogans against the Al Khalifa regime in the capital Manama and in several other cities. The angry demonstrators also called for the lifting of the state of emergency in the country. Well, Bahrain's main opposition group, the Al-Wifaq National Islamic Society, has revealed that Saudi-backed security forces in the tiny Persian Gulf Island kingdom have detained more than 200 children during raids on their homes and schools last year alone.
The largest opposition force in Bahrain has highlighted the various human rights violations that have been committed against children at the hands of the Manama regime over the course of 2013. The findings were presented in a report dubbed Bahrain Repression, The Shadow of Tyranny, which was released on Thursday by Al-Wifaq's Liberties and Human Rights Department, or LHRD. According to the nearly 130-page report, Bahraini regime forces detained 214 children last year, with most of them being detained during raids on their houses. A number of other children were also taken from their schools, the report added. The report further said that the Bahraini regime made 7,342 arbitrary arrests between 2011 and 2013. It also highlighted the demolition of religious structures in the Persian Gulf country, as well as Manama's restrictions on religious freedom. The human rights situation in Bahrain has reached dangerous levels. Bahraini citizens are exposed to different forms of violations, including killing, torture and arrest, said the head of LHRD, Sayyid Hadi al-Musawi. The LHRD official further criticized the international community for remaining silent in the face of the Manama regime's countless human rights violations. The world is standing on the sidelines and watching as the atrocious human rights abuses continue in broad daylight. Over the past 4 years, the Manama regime's human rights record has come under scrutiny from a number of human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, over its handling of the peaceful protests across the Persian Gulf Kingdom. Since mid-February 2011, thousands of anti-regime protesters have held almost daily demonstrations on the streets of Bahrain, calling for the Al Khalifa family to relinquish power. Scores of people have been killed and hundreds of others injured in the Al Khalifa regime's heavy-handed crackdown on peaceful demonstrations.
Well, Afghan presidential frontrunner Abdullah escaped an attempt on his life in Kabul, which left 6 people dead and several others wounded. Now, the attack comes little over a week before Afghans head to the polls to vote in the country's June 14th presidential runoff.
Round 1 of Afghanistan's presidential elections was praised as a success, but the security situation looks more challenging ahead of the June 14th runoff. Only days ahead of the highly contested vote, and this is the aftermath of the latest assault targeting Afghan presidential frontrunner Abdullah. He was just leaving an election rally in the Ariana Hotel in Kabul when a blast hit his campaign motorcade. Abdullah was able to escape, but at least 6 people were killed and 22 others wounded.
The convoy with Dr. Abdullah and his deputy Khan Muhammad was attacked by a suicide bomber. Unfortunately, they were not harmed. So far, we have at least 16 people wounded and 2 martyred.
Witnesses in the area reported hearing 2 explosions at the campaign rally.
A few minutes ago, there were 2 explosions in this area. I don't know whether it was a suicide attack or there were explosives placed inside vehicles.
No group has claimed responsibility for the attack, but the Taliban has reiterated their will to disrupt the election process by carrying out such assaults. This is the first major attack to strike so close to a rally in the ongoing election campaign in Afghanistan, which has given rise to fears that the second round of presidential elections will not go as smoothly as the first.
Well, Japan has reported 2 Chinese ships sailing into disputed waters off Tokyo-administrated islands in the East China Sea. The Japanese Coast Guard said 2 vessels entered the 12 nautical mile band of territorial waters around one of the Senkaku Islands, which China also claims. Although Chinese vessels and aircraft regularly approach Japanese waters, this latest event comes after the G7 leaders cautioned China against what they called intimidation in territorial disputes. Well, Beijing has rebucked the Pentagon's annual report, which asserts that China is increasing military spending through unprecedented levels. The Chinese Defense Ministry said that the U.S. is trying to exaggerate Beijing's military threat.
Asia's red dragon may be a force to reckon with, or at least according to the latest Pentagon report assessing China's military. The world's strongest military powerhouse, or otherwise known as the Pentagon, believes that China is increasing military spending, particularly through the unprecedented modernization of its air force. In its annual report to the Congress, the report states that Beijing's military spending last year exceeded $145 billion. The estimate is more than 20% higher than the official Chinese figure. China has the fiscal strength and the political will to support defense spending growth at comparable levels for the foreseeable future. Continued increases will support the People's Liberation Army modernization efforts and facilitate China's move towards a more professional force. For its part, Beijing has rebuked the document as preposterous criticisms of China's normal defense and military build-up. In a statement on its website, the Chinese Defense Ministry said that year after year, the United States issues the so-called report on military and security developments in China, making preposterous criticisms of China's normal defense and military building, exaggerating the China military threat, which is totally wrong. The The report was centered on China's airspace, pointing out that the PLA's air force is already the biggest in Asia and the third largest in the world. However, the Chinese military may further improve their capability to dominate airspace through the purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system and the advanced Sukhoi Su-35 aircraft. As the US works to secure a foothold in the Asia-Pacific, it looks like the main obstacle will be bypassing China. Beijing is growing both militarily and economically at exponential rates and may one day exceed the US, which has a military budget of $600 billion.
Well, two Hong Kong airlines said they have received a warning from Taiwan over a possible bomb attack targeting a flight to the southern Chinese city. An unnamed Taiwanese law enforcement officer said a female carrying a bomb planned to fly from mainland China to Hong Kong earlier on Friday or Saturday. Details of the nature of the threat were limited, but the warning comes at a time of heightened tension in China with an increase in terrorist attacks in the rest of Xinjiang region. Brazilian subway workers have launched an open-ended strike in Sao Paulo, threatening to cripple the movement of commuters only a few days ahead of the FIFA World Cup.
Here's what the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil looked like on Friday. People waiting and struggling to get from place to place because of a transit strike, which began on Wednesday after bus drivers and fare collectors walked off the job, causing the majority of the system to shut down. Thousands of commuters were left stranded, frantically cramming into metro stations to try to get home.
Generally in the metro, I spend less than 30 minutes. On the bus today, it's already been an hour and a half, and I still have more or less a half hour if there's no traffic. It's delaying everything, you know. It's complicated.
There are 20 million people in the greater metropolitan area, and according to local media, an estimated 4.5 million commuters were affected by the strike.
It's a priority, and it has to be done. And how is the common worker going to get to work? But if they are striking to complain about their situation, it should not affect those also working hard to make a living, support their family.
In just a week, Sao Paulo will host a total of 6 World Cup games, including next week's opener when Brazil plays Croatia. The vast majority of spectators will rely on the metro or train services to arrive at the stadium, which is located on the edge of Sao Paulo's massive metropolitan area. The metro strike is set for an undetermined time, and many activist groups have vowed to intensify their actions during the World Cup.
A gunman suspected of killing 3 police officers and wounding 2 others was arrested early Friday in Canada after a massive manhunt. The search for Justin Burkew, who is alleged to have carried out the brazen attack in the country's eastern province of New Brunswick on Wednesday, had put the city of Montcalm on lockdown for more than a day as police hunted the man described as armed and dangerous.
Unarmed at the time, although there were weapons in the perimeter area. And he was arrested without incident.
Well, Thailand's junta announced that it had arrested the anti-coup leader who faces possible imprisonment as the ruling generals seek to stamp out any criticism of their seizure of power. Now, the anti-coup leader, who spearheaded an online campaign to stage flash mob rallies against the military takeover, was arrested late Thursday in the southeast of the capital, Bangkok. Well, Sudan's youth are using the online social networking service Twitter to help people attain one of the country's most vital food staples, flour. Our Khartoum correspondent, Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, tells us more now about the campaign dubbed 1 kilogram of flour.
Social media networks have opened up a range of possibilities for young people in Sudan. These youths met on Twitter and became friends before launching a campaign dubbed 1 kilogram of flour.
We decided to make this thing or campaign Kilo de Gig, which means 1 kilogram of flour. 1 kilogram of flour can help many people in Sudan because flour is essential.
Flour is indeed essential. It is almost the sole most common ingredient of any meal in the country. It can be used in a variety of recipes and prepared in a multitude of fashions, giving families an array of dish options. The initiative works in a simple yet very effective way.
So basically we meet at open square in downtown Khartoum. It's called Atenei. Okay? Volunteers come there from 5 p.m. till 8 p.m. We receive donation of flour, and we know that some people can't come to us. So we activated the phone number. You can find it on our Facebook page or Twitter accounts.
The volunteers receive these donations and then they proceed to the next stage, distributing flour to different families which they have already identified through meticulous statistics and cooperation with government and popular bodies. The initiative, however, urged these youths to explore more possibilities.
This initiative has made us see another side of Sudan, and this is just the beginning. Kilo Dagig makes us more enthusiastic about more initiatives that could take place in the future and help the people of Sudan. We are looking to solve part of the problem around us. We feel like so far our initiative will succeed in sustaining hundreds of families.
The initiative is a new one, but it had made quite an impression on many. A filmmaker touring through Khartoum was a witness to the effort and the purpose that effort serves.
I'm very impressed. I think I haven't seen anything like that in Khartoum before. And the fact that young people living in central Khartoum do care about the population who is in the outskirts. I don't know if you can call these suburbs IDPs anymore, or I don't know how they call these places, but I visited these places, and definitely a lot of people need that kind of food.
Be it a kilogram of flour or a drop of water, said one beneficiary, charity and human fraternity are what counts, and they are never measured in quantity. 1 kilogram of flour may not be a big donation, but put together, these donations amount to much and can make a difference, with the latter being the very goal these youth are after. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, Al-Tijah News Channel, Khartoum.
Here with Al-Tijah World News, let's take another look at our top stories. Hezbollah Secretary General hails Syria's presidential election results as a victory for the Syrian people. Russia's Putin and his Ukrainian counterpart called for an end to the violence in eastern Ukraine following informal talks. The Iraqi army kills 75 foreign insurgents, while militant attacks across the country leave over 30 dead. And a hunger strike by Palestinians languishing in Israeli jails passes the 40-day mark. That's all the time we have for tonight. From me and the news team, thanks for watching.